She was the voice of Africa in Washington, and that is exactly why she was silenced. When Dr. Arikana Chihombori Quao stepped onto the stage as the African Union's ambassador to the United States, she carried with her more than a diplomatic title. She carried the weight of a continent's stolen dreams. Instead of ribbon-cutting ceremonies and polite speeches, she delivered an indictment. She called out a system that parades as partnership but bleeds as plunder. She named what many whisper but few dare to say aloud, that colonialism never ended. It simply changed its mask. Every empire claims to bring light. But what Dr. Arikana exposed was a shadow that stretches from Paris to Washington, a shadow that keeps Africa chained while the world applauds its independence. And for telling that truth, she was dismissed. Fired, erased from the halls of diplomacy, but not from the memory of millions. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a hinge in history. Subscribe and walk with this story, because what you are about to hear may alter how you see the entire map. The story begins not with a whisper, but with a microphone. Dr. Arikana Chihombori Quao was not a protester on a street corner, not a radical outsider dismissed as irrelevant. She was the official representative of Africa in Washington, the African Union's ambassador to the United States. Her job description expected smiles, ceremonial handshakes, and carefully scripted diplomacy. Instead, she tore up the script. She chose truth over theater. In a series of speeches, Dr. Arikana lifted the curtain on the quiet machinery of control that continues to grip the African continent decades after flags were raised and anthems were sung. She declared that colonialism had not died. It had simply been repackaged in contracts, currencies, and foreign aid. And she laid bare the most glaring example, the franc CFA. This currency, still used by 14 African nations, is printed in France, guaranteed by the French treasury, and bound by rules that force half of their foreign reserves into Parisian vaults. Imagine working tirelessly only to have your wages deposited directly into a stranger's account, with access permitted only when that stranger approves. That is not independence. That is financial captivity dressed as stability. But Dr. Arikana did not stop at currency. She revealed a system designed with surgical precision, military training dictated by France, defense purchases restricted to French suppliers, political alignments tilted not towards neighbors, but towards Paris. Even language, French in schools, French in courts, became both a tool of communication and a chain of command. To an outsider, these might look like remnants of history. To her, they were the steel bars of a prison still in use. The consequences of speaking such truths were immediate. Instead of applause, she was met with dismissal. Her firing from the African Union was not a bureaucratic decision. It was a warning, a message to others who might dare to name the unnameable. History has shown this pattern before. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, assassinated. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, overthrown. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, toppled. Each one punished for declaring that sovereignty is not a performance, but an economic and political reality. By connecting her fate to these figures, the story of Dr. Arikana expands from personal misfortune to continental struggle. She became the latest entry in a long ledger of African leaders and visionaries silenced for refusing to play their assigned roles. Her voice unsettled the very structure of post-colonial order, a structure built to ensure resources flow out, while silence remains within. And here lies the contradiction. If her words were nonsense, they could have been ignored. If her ideas were foolish, they could have been laughed at. But they were not dismissed as comedy. They were treated as a threat. They were met with panic. The mask began to slip, and those who profit from silence understood that exposure is more dangerous than resistance. This is the heart of the event. A diplomat turned dissident, a representative turned rebel, not against Africa, but against the chains hidden in plain sight. She detonated the polite fiction of partnership and revealed the raw reality of dependence. And for that act, the system chose to erase her presence rather than face her words. If colonialism was truly over, why did her microphone trigger fear in capitals from Paris to Washington? The climax of Dr. Arikana's story does not arrive quietly. It erupts in a single unforgettable sentence. Africa is not poor, it is being robbed. In those words, she crystallized a truth that billions suspected, but few dared to articulate. Poverty, she argued, is not the natural state of Africa. It is the product of deliberate extraction, dressed in the language of aid and development. Her words tore through the polite fabric of diplomacy. She exposed how uranium from Niger lights the streets of Paris, while villages in Niger itself remain in darkness. She revealed how Nigeria exports millions of barrels of oil each day, Yet its own citizens wait in endless queues for petrol. She pointed to gold mines in Ghana and cobalt in Congo, resources without which the modern world could not function, and contrasted them with the hunger and deprivation in the very lands that produced them. These were not abstract theories. They were facts written in contracts, currencies, and statistics. But what transformed her speeches into a global flashpoint was not merely their content, but their stage. She spoke not only to Africans, who already knew much of this reality, but also to American audiences on American soil. She lifted the veil before the citizens of the very nations whose prosperity rests on Africa's extraction. And once those words left her lips, silence was no longer an option for those who benefit from the status quo. The African Union acted swiftly, stripping her of her position. Officially, the decision was presented as administrative. Unofficially, it was understood as capitulation to pressure. It echoed an old pattern. Those who shout too loudly are removed, not debated. It was an act not of governance, but of fear. Meanwhile, international reactions followed predictable lines. Western governments remained silent, preferring not to dignify her charges with direct responses. Silence itself was an answer, proof that her words landed too close to the truth. African commentators, however, drew parallels with past martyrs. They placed her alongside Sankara, Lumumba, and Gaddafi, not because she shared their fate of assassination or overthrow, but because she shared their crime of naming exploitation. The media response was fractured. Independent platforms amplified her message, replaying her speeches across diaspora communities. Grassroots voices praised her courage, yet mainstream outlets, especially in Europe and North America, treated her either with caution or outright omission. For them, amplifying her voice risked validating the very critique they wished to bury. Inside Africa, however, something stirred. Citizens across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger recognized echoes of their own struggles. They saw her words not as abstract diplomacy, but as fuel for a broader movement of defiance against the lingering presence of foreign control. The firing of Dr. Arikana did not silence the message, it amplified it. By punishing her, the system confirmed the reality she had described. This is the paradox of repression. Every attempt to bury truth is also a confession that truth exists. Every silenced voice becomes a louder symbol. And in the case of Dr. Arikana, her removal transformed her from a bureaucrat into a beacon. She was no longer bound by the etiquette of diplomacy. She became instead a living testimony to the fragility of the narrative that Africa is free, equal, and sovereign. As the dust settled, one question reverberated across the continent and beyond. If colonialism had truly ended, why does a woman lose her job simply for naming its survival? What happens when truth itself becomes treated as a weapon? When the words of Dr. Arikana reverberated through the halls of power, their echoes did not fade. They traveled beyond Washington and Paris into African capitals, villages, and diasporic communities. The immediate consequence of her dismissal was outrage, but the deeper consequence was awakening. Ordinary citizens began to revisit questions long considered taboo. What does sovereignty truly mean? How much of independence is symbolic and how much is substantive? For the people of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, her words struck like flint on dry grass. These were nations already simmering with discontent over foreign military presence and economic dependency. In Ouagadougou, when Ibrahim Traoré emerged to challenge the existing order, his message carried striking parallels to Dr. Arikana's. He declared that Burkina Faso's gold, cotton, and soil belonged not to Paris but to Burkinabe hands. His rise was no isolated event. It was part of a broader current that drew strength from the truths others had spoken before him. This is where the line between diplomacy and revolution blurs. Dr. Arikana's microphone may have been removed, but her message fueled the legitimacy of movements across the Sahel. Citizens began to view aid not as generosity but as a leash. Contracts were no longer just agreements but shackles. The dismissal of one ambassador sharpened the resolve of millions to question whether sovereignty could ever be real while currencies, armies, and resources remained under external command. The diaspora, too, responded. Students in American universities, activists in European capitals, and professionals across Canada and the Caribbean echoed her call. For years, many had been taught to view Africa through the lens of pity, a continent in perpetual need. But her words reframed the narrative. Africa was not weak. It was wealthy, and its poverty was not natural but manufactured. That framing gave new meaning to remittances, investments, and returns. A doctor opening a clinic in Ghana or an engineer starting a firm in Nigeria was no longer charity, it was reclamation. At the political level, African governments found themselves caught in tension. To embrace her message openly risked alienating powerful allies. To reject it outright risked appearing complicit in exploitation. This ambiguity created a fragile balance, where official statements avoided direct endorsement but public sentiment surged. The silence of elites contrasted with the roar of citizens, and yet the story also carried risks. Rising anti-French sentiment led to expulsions of troops, but it also threatened to isolate countries economically. Leaders who aligned with her perspective faced sanctions, aid cuts, and diplomatic pressure. The price of defiance was steep, and the consequences unpredictable. Sovereignty, as she reminded the world, is not free. It demands sacrifice. The deeper political effect was psychological. A narrative long suppressed had finally broken through. If one diplomat could expose the scaffolding of dependence, then millions could demand its dismantling. If one woman could connect past martyrs like Sankara and Lumumba with present struggles, then perhaps the cycle could be broken. But the haunting question lingered in every discussion. What happens when truth collides with survival? For nations dependent on foreign aid, for leaders balancing fragile economies, is it safer to remain silent or risk everything by speaking? And what happens when millions decide that silence is no longer an option? The story of Dr. Arikana does not exist in isolation. It is woven into the fabric of international politics, where Africa's place at the table remains contested. Her criticism of the United Nations cut especially deep. Africa makes up more than a quarter of the UN's membership, yet not a single African nation holds a permanent seat on the Security Council. 54 voices can shout no, but one veto from Washington, Paris, London, Moscow, or Beijing silences them all. This imbalance is not accidental. It is a relic of 1945, frozen in time while empires dissolved, but their privileges remained intact. Her words expose the hypocrisy of a global order that calls itself just while excluding those it governs most. Blue helmets may flood African battlefields. Billions may be spent on peacekeeping, but when it comes to decisions that truly shape war, sanctions, or intervention, Africa remains voiceless. For her, the UN was less the conscience of humanity and more the gatekeeper of power. The international reaction to such critiques revealed the fault lines. In Paris, the emphasis was on preserving influence through currency arrangements, defense agreements, and the ever-controversial franc CFA. In Washington, silence masked discomfort. To acknowledge her message risked validating it, yet ignoring it could not erase the rising tide of frustration sweeping across the continent. Across the Sahel, her words resonated with movements rejecting foreign troops and demanding control of their own futures. In Burkina Faso, the spirit of resistance crystallized in what many called the Burkina Faso Revolution. Citizens rallied not only against external domination, but also against domestic leaders seen as collaborators. Here, Dr. Arikana's dismissal became symbolic. Proof that telling the truth about global inequities could cost you your position, yet also grant you immense legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary people. Internationally, her voice added to a growing chorus calling for reform of global institutions. The African Union, the Economic Community of West African States, and other regional bodies face a choice. Remain within a system tilted against them, or demand a seat at the table equal to their demographic and economic weight. Her firing was intended as an ending. Instead, it became an amplification. A reminder that Africa's struggle for dignity is not confined to its borders, but is entangled in the architecture of global power. And so the question lingers. If one small landlocked nation can rise against this order, what stops the rest from following? The future of Africa, as framed by Dr. Arikana, is not a plea for sympathy, but a demand for sovereignty. Her vision points towards a continent where contracts are rewritten, resources are processed locally, and profits remain on African soil. The path is neither simple nor without sacrifice, but it is one that redefines dignity not as a gift bestowed, but as a right reclaimed. Central to this vision is the African diaspora. For too long, generations of Africans abroad were taught to forget, assimilate, and cut ties. Yet, as Dr. Arikana reminded them, they are Africa's secret weapon. A doctor trained in Boston who returns to Accra with knowledge, an engineer from Toronto who invests in Lagos, a coder in Silicon Valley who builds an app in Nairobi. Each act chips away at dependency and replaces it with autonomy. Every connection made is one less contract controlled by foreign interests. But the road ahead is fraught with obstacles. Foreign powers will not surrender willingly. They will deploy sanctions, propaganda, and even destabilization to maintain access to the resources that fuel their economies. Within Africa, elites who benefit from the existing order may resist reform, fearing the loss of privileges secured through collaboration. And for ordinary citizens, the burden of transition, higher costs, economic retaliation, political instability, may test patience and unity. Yet hope endures. Across the Sahel, across West Africa, across the continent, voices are rising in unison. The message of sovereignty once silenced is now sung in different tongues, across borders from capital cities to villages. Movements inspired by her courage remind the world that Africa is not asking to be saved. It is choosing to save itself. The next chapter will not be written by foreign diplomats, but by Africans themselves. It will not be dictated in Paris or Washington, but shaped in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Accra, Kinshasa, and beyond. It will be forged not only by leaders, but by citizens who insist that their soil, sweat, and sacrifice must yield fruit for their own children. And yet the question remains, who truly fears a free Africa? In the end, the story of Dr. Arikana is not about one woman losing one position. It is about a continent confronting the lies written into its history. She dared to remind the world that independence is not a song, not a ceremony, not a flag flapping in the wind. Independence means control of money, of resources, of destiny. Without that control, the anthem is hollow, the flag is a costume, and sovereignty is an illusion. Her dismissal was supposed to end the conversation. Instead, it fueled it. Across Africa and beyond, her voice now echoes in movements demanding dignity. From Ouagadougou, where a new generation of leaders emerged, to diasporic communities reconnecting with their roots, the spirit she embodied refuses to die. The struggle is not about charity, but about justice. Not about pity, but about partnership. As the winds of change blow through Burkina Faso and the Sahel, as movements ignite under the banner of resistance, one lesson stands clear. Truth cannot be permanently silenced. It can be punished, but it cannot be buried. The Ibrahim Traoré coup stands as a modern chapter in this long narrative. Proof that voices once dismissed now shape nations. And the Burkina Faso revolution is not an isolated fire, but part of a growing blaze, demanding that Africa no longer serve as the engine of global wealth without sharing its rewards. The question left for us is urgent. Will Africa's future be written by those who profit from its silence, or by its own people who refuse to be silenced? The answer depends not on governments alone, but on millions who choose whether to remain bystanders or to become participants in history. If this story resonates with your sense of justice, do not turn away. Subscribe, share, and add your voice to a movement that refuses to accept illusions as freedom. Because only together can we ensure that the next generation inherits not chains, but choices,